our two chapters are about ethnicity and about body. How many do not know about the different ethnic issues of blacks in America? Kind of are a little ignorant of all that. How about the ethnicity of the different Hispanic cultures within America? Maybe a little bit better because that's kind of our area. It's really interesting to deal with that. When I was teaching first, second, and third grade bilingual classes, my recently arrived kids were very different than the folks who had been in America for a while and had history in America. And there was sometimes animosity between those two different groups, a sense of who's better, who's worse. But one thing that was borne out and what he brings up in here is that sometimes what we attribute to ethnicity is something very different. Okay, so in my classrooms, where I had those kids who had just arrived from Mexico somewhere probably in their lifetime, or at least from their parents coming before they were born, there was a sense of going upward, right? That we'd moved forward. The immigrant thing that he talked about in here. Whereas some of my other kids, and I don't mean just my Hispanic kids, but my Anglos and my African-American kids, oftentimes their family were on a downward trajectory. They'd had a poor experience. They didn't care about their kids' educational experience. And so it was like crossing like this, and they might have been at about the same level, but how they were moving, what they saw as the possibilities economically, as well as the advantage, the possibilities in front of them were very, very different. And yet we, like he said here, lump them all in one piece, and we say they're all the same. Which is convenient for us as Anglos, isn't it? But what's that do to our relationship to those around us? It necessarily puts us into a space where we are less than good at relating to them. And in ethnic spaces, we have to, I think, try very hard to not take the easy routes. If we always take all of them are like, or whatever definition we have of, then we will almost always be incorrect, at least in part. Because are there generalities about Hispanics in America? Absolutely. Are there generalities about African Americans? Absolutely. But are you going to be proved wrong much of the time in those generalities? Absolutely. So when have you faced some of that where you assumed one thing, but you learned something different?
Well, I can think of the experience of somebody with what I thought was a Hispanic name not being able to speak Spanish.
Yeah.
So I had that generalization and prejudice kind of, and I was wrong.
Right.
It's embarrassing. For them too, as for me.
Absolutely. I grew up in high school down in South Texas and then went up to East Texas State, which is about an hour outside of Dallas to the east. And me and a friend of mine, a Hispanic man, were there in our dorms, and someone comes up to us and begins speaking Spanish to my friend. And I got to tell you, I didn't know Spanish at the time, but I knew more Spanish than my Hispanic friend. Right? And that's because that other person assumed something about him that may not be true.
Just like what I said, exactly.
Yeah. How about the rest of you? Yes, Marty.
Over the years, we've had a lot of Hispanic people working in our yard. When we first moved here, we did a lot of landscaping. We put in a pool that, not in this house, but in the first house we lived in. And we had been told, you know, you have to be careful about these people because they're real lazy. So you got to watch them. And and make sure that they're, and what a joke. I mean, really, these people work harder than I've ever seen anybody work. And I mean, they're here and they work solid the whole time that they're here. And the people that built our pool, they would take about 45 minutes in the middle of the day and rest and have their lunch. And there was this one guy who would he would lie in the wheelbarrow. He would lie in the wheelbarrow and take a nap. But his 45 minutes was up and he was back down working. And we have never since had that feeling at all. And Joe worked a lot with Habitat for Humanity, and he'd heard about the welfare queens, and he said, I didn't meet a single one of them. And this was years ago, because it was before, really before the Habitat started building houses for people that were a little bit further along in their movement towards independence. But I mean, we just have not had that experience with those people. So I have great respect for them.
And yet those stories persist, don't they, Marty?
Yes.
It's amazing how.
Yes, they do. Of course.
Yeah, it's amazing how often we tell that type of story because we want it to be true. At least as he was telling the stories. Yeah, at least as he was telling the stories of the different groups within the Black community, I think it had something to do with we all like to look down on somebody.
Yes.
Right? That's why we told Pollock jokes, right? Because then I can look down on them. Rarely are those things true. And yet we persist in that, maybe because it helps us feel one step up the ladder from.
Well, I think it also has something to do with not trying to comprehend why things are so different. Why is this group in a different place than this group? And it's just like, I mean, in rape culture, for example, when it's like, why did that person get raped and I didn't? It's kind of a way to distance yourself by explaining that it was something about them rather than about the world outside.
Yeah, she must have worn something that made it so that she allowed herself to be more vulnerable.
She was out on time. And so,
and I don't
so when
of
people look at those differences and they can see, and it's kind of avoid recognizing why, I mean, trying sense of why things are so different for different populations. But the other piece of it is just so that you don't have to confront what's actually happened. So that seems to me to be part of it.
Isn't it amazing how much we do things in order to not have to confront, right? To be in a space of relative peace, relative ease, and yet who pays the price for that? Because someone usually does for all of our ease, right? I love the thing where he said, what we really have to ask. He said at one point, an ethnic racist asks, why are Black immigrants doing better than African Americans? But an ethnic anti-racist asks, why are Black immigrants not doing as well as other immigrant groups?
Mm.
And the difference is this, the one is a blaming, they're not doing well enough. The other is saying, what is wrong that this group is having trouble too? What are the pieces in place that maybe I can affect in some way or another? And see, that's a much more difficult, that takes me out of my ease. The other is just, it's all them. The second is what do I have to do? How can I affect things? And the problem with that, one of the reasons why we easily do that is because how many have already seen in our discussions that solving the racial issues is not a simple task.
Mhm.
There's a bit of work that has to be done to be able to do that. And so we easily retreat from it rather than daring ourselves to have the courage and the strength to move towards. I've been in a very long conversation on Facebook with a couple of friends of mine. I call them friends, but they're really kind of the ones I argue with all the time. And much of their stuff is they want to just distance themselves from words like racist, sexist. In fact, at one point, one of these ladies, who was a Native American woman, just sent this thing out that just called me all of those kinds of names, right? And said, I wanted you to see what it felt like when you guys call us that. So I'm not calling you that. I'm saying that I'm taking that on for myself, and I think you ought to take it on for yourself as well. And I said, here's why I like that I can call myself racist, because it means that I'm hearing my African American friend who is saying what you just said, right? Or I'm listening to the woman who is saying those words you're using or that thing, that's not fair to my gender. And that means I have to be listening instead of just making an assumption. And I like that he said, as a Black community, they have to be listening different. Just as we as a white community have to be listening different. But listening can be hard work. I don't know if you've recognized that yet. Right? But truly truly listening takes some time and effort. Leticia?
That's been my struggle over the last 30 years with the Hispanic community.
Mm-hmm.
Because not so much racist, it's part of a victim mentality that they were pushed into. So within that victim mentality, they're on the offense all the time.
Right.
So there's a certain amount of racism that comes through.
Uh-huh.
But it comes from a different place. It's not systematic, it's a defense mechanism.
Yeah. But if we take easy definitions, they are rarely as helpful to us, right? So to say something like, well, Africans sold themselves to be slaves. Well, they really didn't. They sold people in the next tribe over, the next country over, that to them felt as different as when we in Europe were doing the same thing, right? Taking slaves of the next countries over. We turned it into the very ethnic thing that all of those Africans are. We talked about that a lot last week. So how do we not give into that simple definition again? Or in our conversations with other people, how do we derail them from taking it down those same types of roads? I think much of it comes down to choosing how you point the fingers. That it's not those folks, they did, and making it in a way that it excuses us. Instead, stepping into what do we do? How could our ancestors have done it better, and how do we correct what they did? How do we step into this conversation right now, even though I think I already have right answers? But how do I listen to this person who maybe has different answers?
I still like my t-shirt idea, right? I was telling Jim I want to make a t-shirt. The back it says, we are all Elephant Man. And in the front it says, I am a human being.
Yeah. Yeah. Have I told you the story before about what we were doing with homeless down in Yuma about names? Let me tell you that story. I think it's instructive in this. So we were working a lot with the homeless population at the Yuma church where I was at, which sits right across from the public library, which has a great big lawn and lots of trees. It's a great place for homeless to hang out at. We're not far from the river, which is where they typically sleep at night. And so we began opening our doors to be a cooling shelter during the summer because it gets a bit hot in Yuma. And some of the folks struggled with that. And so we had a meeting to try to bring things together. And what it kind of became was, here are the members over here are the homeless over here, right? And it had that sense of, how do we argue with each other? Then there was one lady right in the middle. Her name was Marilyn. You might have met her. She's come to St. Francis a couple of times. And Marilyn steps up and said, well, you know, I'm trying to understand all of this and what to do. And the homeless, wait, I don't even know, is that what you like to be called? Turning to the folks over here.
Oh yeah, I remember.
And this one lady raised her hand and very bravely said, you know, I like to be called Daphne, right? To see a person instead of a group.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem, isn't it? That's the difficulty, but the ongoing issue that we have to do. Because this person in front of us has all kinds of nuances to who they are. Maybe knows very well which African country they came from and has a lot of pride to that. Maybe has no clue at all about that, right? Maybe has had long connections to who their ancestors were. Maybe has no connection at all. But we don't know that unless we talk to them, do we? And then it gets compounded by the second chapter, and that's where I want to spend more of our time, because I think that's where it's going to hit us even harder. It's really, really easy for us to see body. And do you see what he was meaning by that? Is that we see something about that person or something about that group that we define something as. So let me tell you my own experience. Between 9th and 10th grade, I moved from northern Colorado down to South Texas and moved to this medium-sized town called Beeville. And Beeville has about 10% Black, more or less, which is somewhere close to the national average. So it's not outside of the norms that way. But I'd never been in a town that big. I mean, that big of a population of African American. You know, I knew Roger T. Smedley, who was one of my running buddies up in Fort Collins, but all of a sudden here I was. And I got to tell you, as a little sophomore, skinny little distance runner, I was really awed by some of the amazing athletes that I had on my track team. Mike Johnson was this tall, impressively powerful high hurdler and high jumper. He won state in high jumping in the state of Texas. Just an impressive, and I was, you know, he was one who body-wise made me fearful. Not in the I'm afraid of it, but man, I can't do anything. Who is that man in front of me? And I think we have to be careful about how we view the bodies around us, especially when we have martialized all of those bodies sometimes so much. And you saw how in his story, he told a lot about how Black bodies are those which cause violence, and every single one of them causes violence, right? He who was being, in some ways, victimized by other Black bodies also saw the fear in people's eyes as they looked at him. Why do we do that? And what do we do about it? Go ahead.
I read a conversation on Facebook this morning, and it was about guns, right? And it got curious because it was responsible gun owners kind of thing, and somebody got shot for some reason. And one lady said, I'm curious to know if there's any Hispanics or Black that open carry on a holster. Because I know the only Blacks and Hispanics that carry guns are gang members.
And we do a whole bunch of assuming that that's a true statement, don't we? How have you heard the story about violence in Black bodies in America? What are some of the stories, some of the ways you've heard that played out in America?
The right like to say, we don't talk about black on black crime. Look at how many of them kill each other in Chicago.
Mm-hmm. You're exactly right. They divert that back there and say, look at this crime that they're perpetuating on themselves. What else? I'll give you an example. I have a friend of mine, her husband is my nephew. So I don't know what that would make her to me. Nephew, wife-in-law. Her name is Christy. She lives in the Dallas area. And she has tragically a friend who was killed by an illegal immigrant. Horrible, horrible thing to have happen. But because of that, she thinks all immigrants are killers. And she can't get past that image, that they only come here. And to be fair to her, there's a lot of where some people perpetuate that for political gain or for advantage of some sort. But it's just not true, is it? But seeing that brown body as being always a perpetuator of violence makes it so that she has a really hard time relating to what is in Texas, a pretty large proportion of the population, right? And to hear the difference, the truth about something like that. For example, in Texas itself, the population, the newly arrived immigrant population of Hispanics is here, and their incarceration rate is very low compared to, for example, whites, where it's the opposite. White population has a higher rate of incarceration than their population. So she's putting she's putting it wrongly on them. Immigrants are not the killers in Texas. It is white men with guns. But it's an easy thing for her to do because we taught ourselves to be afraid of. And there's a lot of political messages that say that population does. Go ahead.
There's a fear factor that you got to go through too and get over. Like, a couple of years ago, I got mugged by two big black guys.
Right.
It took me a couple of years not to hesitate anytime I came in view of a black man over 6 foot tall.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was purely a subconscious reaction.
Yeah.
But it still affects the people around me.
Yeah, but let me tell you this, Leticia, it is not just a subconscious reaction. It is a reaction that is easy to receive because of many of the messages that are all around us. Okay, it may be true that none of us have truly been in a dangerous position when it comes to somebody of color, right? I don't want to speak for all of you, but as a general rule, you saw his statistics that the number of us that are actually victims of a crime is very low. And yet we are all more fearful of that crime than what our experience warrants. We're told that that black man who's walking down the street is more dangerous than what he is. And so our fear levels go up, not just because we have something, but because society has told us to be more fearful of him than what we should be.
I have to add for you that don't, Jim knows this story. Part of the fear, Jim, is
Yes.
my reaction.
Right.
Those two men left the scene in an ambulance.
Uh-huh.
I'm a second-degree black belt. So it's kind of double for me. I don't want to do that again.
Right.
It's in 28 years that I've studied, that's the only time I've ever laid hands on anybody.
Yeah. So what has taught you to be fearful? What are the messages that you've heard through your life that have said Black body is dangerous, or Hispanic body is dangerous, or something other than however you define yourself is dangerous? What have you heard through your life?
Well, the summer that I worked at a church, Methodist church camp, and there was it was intentionally set up to have kids from Chicago as well as kids from the suburbs and the rural areas. So it was supposed to be a whole mix. And this one boy, he was a delight. I just loved him to pieces. And he said, "Will you come visit me?" And I said, "Sure, after I'm done here, I'll come visit you." And then I talked to some of the other counselors who were from Chicago, and they were like, "You can't possibly go there. It's so dangerous. You can't do that." And there was no way I could get an information to him to say that I wasn't coming. But they were so, and it was 1969, and so there was a lot of turmoil in the city, and but there were several people who also were counselors at the church camp who were like, "No, you're out of your mind," and I never did get to go, and it's been one of the sadnesses of my life.
Right. But that type of fear, Barbara, however well established it is in reality, of us not entering into those neighborhoods, of staying away from, makes it so that those neighborhoods have the potential to get more and more dangerous.
Oh yeah.
Because we don't help the infrastructure and the relationship and all of that, which will help those spaces to heal. If they are truly broken in some way and they are dangerous, then we as a community need to move towards those spaces, right? Because otherwise,
Oh, absolutely.
fear builds on fear, evil builds on evil, violence builds on violence.
Yep.
But I loved his where he talked about his neighborhood, talked about the other kid there, right? And he said, "I knew it wasn't that being violent wasn't blackness, because blackness was a constant, meaning that there were a whole lot of other people who were of color like himself, who were not violent. So what were the things that were causing that violence, that fear, that uncertainty in that area? The kid you met obviously didn't portray whatever the other counselors were seeing in his neighborhood. That he as an individual had some other definition than what they think that you should have been fearful of where he lived. But you needed to be able to go into that neighborhood to see why it was that he saw something different."
That's akin to that argument that the right likes to make when Blacks and Hispanics are subject to police violence, right? If you just don't resist, if you just follow the law, and it's an assumption that every single one of them are resisting or breaking the law at some point.
Right. And so we build up laws. So let's go to today's headlines. Breonna Taylor. How many know the story pretty well of Breonna Taylor? Okay, Black woman, asleep in bed. Police came with a very interesting warrant. A warrant that was built, that was passed into law to be able to overcome what some people saw as a difficulty. It was a warrant that was a no-knock warrant, it's called, meaning they didn't have to announce that they were police. They didn't have to follow certain procedures that, in my mind, are due process type of procedures. They were able to just knock down the door. Breonna's boyfriend, who was not the best of people, had a gun, but what he saw were intruders, and he began shooting, and that gave them permission to shoot as much as they wanted to, and they shot her sleeping in bed multiple times. And so this week, they were acquitted of all charges except for one man who shot things into the air, which hit plaster, but the ones that hit the person, he's not being prosecuted for at all.
Yeah, right.
And so our law made it easy for him to do and be excused of, not just him, but the other two, to be excused from what to me is a very heinous event. Right? Here's a completely innocent person that gets killed and nothing happens. And that often happens in these types of events. When police officers kill someone who is Black, there's all kinds of ways that they are let off of justice and not charged. So as a Black community, how are you going to continue to react? Because essentially what's happening there is they are following what he's outlining in this story. Black is dangerous, so we get to have some liberty about what we do and how we react to. And so, of course, Breonna Taylor, who you say is innocent, it was okay for us to shoot her.
I understand the boyfriend also had a legal gun. It was a legal gun. It was registered.
Yeah. It's not that I don't want to excuse the boyfriend.
No,
The boyfriend
no,
had problems.
no. It's just the assumption that they were looking for something, and the assumption was that he didn't have the right to protect himself the way he did.
That's right.
Yeah.
Like you said,
They also
it
were
was just an
accusing him of
intruder.
being a drug peddler, and that they didn't find any drugs in her apartment.
And go ahead, Marty.
What has bothered me more than anything is that at the very same time, or previously, actually, it had happened before, they had actually arrested the person that they were looking for.
Yep.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
So
he was off the streets, the person.
I didn't hear that.
Mhm.
Yeah, between the communication between the police, these people had no, in my mind, had no right to be at her door because we had already arrested the person they were looking for.
Yeah.
So somebody did not tell them.
Yeah.
Or else they thought, well, we're just going to go ahead and do this anyway. So this is what's bothered me more than anything else.
Yeah. Well, and here's the thing. That type of story gets repeated way too often in ethnic neighborhoods. In fact, if we look here on my screen towards my left and towards the lower side of the screen, I have two blonde Minnesotans. And of course, we know how dangerous blonde Minnesotans like Marty and Nancy are. And we can just look at them and see how horribly dangerous they are, right? That type of statement is what's happening on a regular basis in the Black community. And assumptions are being made about a particular group, and excuses and laws are being passed like the no-knock warrant that allow police officers to be much more violent in the moment, even though the person in front of them may not warrant any of that. It doesn't matter how much blonde Minnesotans are evil. I know Marty and Nancy, and I know they are not. How about you guys? Right? And so somehow we have to figure out how to help our police officers to not assume that violence is the first reaction here, because that's not the first thing today.
What you see more in this area from police officers, in the 90s, I had to drive around with my baptismal certificate, my birth certificate, and a couple other forms of ID because I drove a Jaguar at the time. And they'd see this brown face in that Jaguar, and I got pulled over for everything.
Yeah. Why would
It
someone
was
like
after
her?
dark.
Yeah. instant suspicion. Why would someone like her have a car like this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what I was teaching at that time was to arm ourselves with knowing the law.
Yeah.
Because at one point, INS had stopped me, and they did the normal, do you know why I pulled you over, ma'am? And I said, no, I don't. My driver's license is, or my registration is full. I wasn't speeding. My lights all work. So how can I help you, officer? And he told me, well, this is just a normal DUI check. I said, not in Arizona.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it wasn't until I said my brother-in-law and sister worked for DPS, and the DPS officer came, that he backed, and the DPS officer said, back away from her. This is not, and I'm 100% sure, had I not had that connection to DPS, they would have taken me in.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's what we have to first of all do as individuals, white individuals in our particular place where we are. Where is it that you fear the black body? Where is it that you fear the Hispanic body? How is it that things have been taught to you in the past about what they're like that still have a hold on you? And how are you going to actively and intentionally be different? Because we've all had lots of years of hearing about how they perpetuate crime. Some of it based in reality, some of it way beyond reality. But we need to look at it, and we need to decide, how do I exercise that from me? Like, which neighborhoods in Tucson are you less reluctant to go into because you know that they're those kinds of neighborhoods? If you're walking down a street and someone's walking the other way, what kind of characteristics do they have that might make you more fearful? And are those based in reality or in some story? Go ahead.
I have never experienced this in Tucson at all. But our daughter lives in Columbus, Ohio, and lives right at the edge of the city and near a very main thoroughfare. And the store that I was there one time when a new baby had just come, and I was the person who went to the grocery store.
Okay.
It was a large grocery store, and oftentimes I had to go there after dark. And I had very good experiences inside the grocery store with other Black women and with the people that were checking me out and all of that. But there was more than one experience in the parking lot when I was getting out of my car, and there was a group of 6 or 8 Black guys, young Black guys, walking towards me in a line, not moving, not giving anybody any space. They were like a big line of Black bodies coming towards me. And this was very intimidating.
Yeah, it is intimidating, isn't it?
More than once. And because I'm alone in the parking lot with this very intimidating bunch of young Black men headed my direction, I just stood my ground and by the side of my car and let them pass, because I mean, to have done anything else would have been stupid in my mind.
Yeah.
So this is, and this, Columbus has a very large population of Black people. I never lived in a place that had that kind of a population.
Yeah.
And this was very intimidating to me. I do not lump all of them together because inside, I mean, there were several times when I'm lost in this big Myers store and I asked a little black lady, I'm looking for, can you help me find it? And they would be lovely to me, but that was not.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Because there are intimidating places. It's not that some of our fear isn't there. Part of the story you need to tell yourself about that is in that situation, either because of what you did or because of who they were, nothing did happen. They weren't there to beat up that beautiful young lady in front of them, even though it felt like it in the moment, right? And so one of the points he makes is we have to start basing our things on what did happen instead of what could happen based on my biggest fears. And that's hard to separate sometimes because my biggest fears sometimes come true to some degree. Some stories continue to be there that are true stories, but what are they in the larger picture too?
I think the answer is not to lump everybody into that same
That's
fear.
right. That's right.
And even what they were trying to do was not, I didn't fear that they were going to beat me up.
Yeah.
What they were doing was asserting their authority in that situation.
Okay.
It was, you stay out of our way. You just stay out of our way.
Yeah, kind of, this is my neighborhood type of thing.
This is that you're after dark, just stay out of my way.
Yeah.
And so I did.
Yeah.
But I mean, that doesn't mean that every time I run across a black person that I have that same fear.
Yeah. And that's the challenge, especially if there has been a real instance of the reality of, then you have to very purposely choose differently because you know something that could happen. You have to decide, is it happening now with this person who has whatever resemblance to the other situation? It's an ongoing issue, isn't it? I want to get to one of his big conclusions, though. Why is it that black neighborhoods are dangerous? Did you hear what he concluded that way? Go ahead. You have to turn on your volume, although you sound really good without it.
One of the things I've noticed over the years is that there's for many whites, there's a bit of disconcertedness in ethnic communities because we tend to be louder. It's part of the culture. We overexpress many times, blacks and Hispanics, and that's disconcerting for many. We don't have the same social volume, and that in itself can be something that's off-putting.
Yep.
So I'm looking at
I
this
didn't-
paragraph that he has at the end. You said how he sums it up, his three main strategies.
Yes.
Segregation is called them war zones for tough policing and mass incarceration.
Yes.
Assimilants said they need tough laws and tough love for mentors and fathers to civilize them. Anti-racists say they need higher paying jobs within their reach, especially black youngsters. So there's three different strategies for reducing violent crime in black neighborhoods, according to Imran.
That's right.
But it's interesting to me that he was scared of other black folks.
Yeah.
And then he boiled it down to that there's no such thing as a dangerous racial group, but there are, of course, dangerous individuals like Smurf. But when somebody was telling her story about the parking lot, I was thinking, I remember walking on the street in Flagstaff. If there were a group of young teenagers, I would get scared.
Mm-hmm.
If there were just a couple, I was fine. But that mob thing is what scared me. But also
Thing isn't.
the the teenager that has such poor impulse control. So
Yeah.
it wasn't a skin color or ethnicity problem thing. It was ageism for me.
But Judith, that's part of the reason why kids tend to have gangs, and sometimes we've defined that in its worst possible way because it sometimes takes on that form. But gangs are a way to be able to have community, and
Yes.
to where I by myself lack power as a gang, I gain some strength, some power, some
Correct.
position, and so in a very real way, it's done so that you are a bit intimidated by that. So, Barbara, you were going to say something.
I was just wanting to understand what you said, Letitia. Who are you talking about in terms of who had the louder voice and the less loud voice? Muted. You're muted.
Ethnic groups, Hispanics, Blacks, tend to be more boisterous when they're in
Okay.
groups, right?
Okay.
And when I'm within mostly white community, I gotta watch my tone. Because
Got
over
it.
the
Okay.
years, I've been told you're a little too loud, Letitia. You laugh too loud. But that's just part of how we're
Got it.
raised.
Okay. Yeah. You can see it in the church all the time, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to go back to the piece that Judith talked about and the pieces just before that. His point is anti-racist figure out that there is one thing that helps in this dynamic about fear of the Black body, that those neighborhoods, the key element that is missing in those neighborhoods is employment. Okay? Much of that was a deliberate strategy through the 30s, 40s, 50s called redlining, where we very purposely tried to block good commerce out of those areas. So there wasn't as much job. There wasn't as much opportunity. And because of that, okay, so if you don't have a job and you felt barred from being able to work and support your family, when would things become desperate in your mind and you would go over the line in order to care for them? What would it take for you? And in many ways, that's what the poverty-stricken areas of the United States are dealing with. I need to feed my family. I need to be responsible. I need to do the right thing. How do I do that? And too often that means if legitimate ways of employment are blocked, then we turn to something less. And I'm not trying to excuse as much as I'm trying to say, if we don't understand that and we continue to just blame the person who is doing instead of blaming the system that isn't giving enough jobs, then we're not going to deal with the real problem, aren't we? I love the two examples that he gave, where he said one summer Chicago Plus Jobs program found a 43% reduction in violent crime arrests for Black youth who worked 8-week-long part-time summer jobs. When they had jobs, crime went down. The other one was that between 1992 and 1997, there was a 2.5% decrease in unemployment, and it resulted in a decrease of 4.3% for robbery, 2.5% for auto theft, 5% for burglary, 3.7%, going everywhere from 100% decrease, 100% correlation between those two to where it was twice as much. Why? Because when you have job, when you have purpose, when you're bringing in money, then the other becomes less essential. So what do? What's that say to us? At least one of the ways we can respond is to look in our city and say, where is it that unemployment is higher? And how do we help in those neighborhoods? And we don't all have the ability to create jobs, but we do have the ability to work with, for example, in Tucson, we have an amazing program called Job Paths. How many know about that? Job Path is an incredible program that essentially is working to help create jobs and create people who can step into those jobs to be able to lower these types of incidences. Because if someone has a job, we take some of the other issues off the table as well. So maybe you can't create jobs, but maybe what you want to do is look into programs like Job Path and see if that's a place where you could donate time, donate money, donate efforts to be able to help them. Some kind of support. What other things in Tucson are dealing with that? Marty, go ahead.
I was just going to say that another organization that really is, I think, doing a great job of helping is Youth on Their Own.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You know, these youth are oftentimes just put out on the street because of either abuse in their family or drug abuse in their families or because of whatever reason. And Youth on Their Own gives them the opportunity to go to school.
Yep.
And almost 100% of success with these kids. You can't be using drugs and get in this program, but it's a fantastic program, and they're being very successful. These kids are going to college, they're getting jobs.
Right.
Education is a great equalizer, and it does help in that whole process.
Thank you for pointing them out, because they are one of the organizations that, and relatively new to Tucson within the last 10 years, and just making incredible strides in helping some of these issues. Leticia.
Youth on Their Own is interesting, especially in this day and age. An unreal proportion of those kids are kicked out of their house because they've identified as gay or lesbian.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You're exactly right. No matter where you live, you can find some spaces where you can take a position to help some of these issues. If, as he asserts, that employment is the primary issue that will lower violence in these areas, find a way to work in that area. There's a program there somewhere around you. And wouldn't it be great to be able to say, look, in Tucson, unemployment went down this much and crime went down this much, right? Wouldn't it be great to say that? So that might be what you're being led to in all of this. Maybe that's the way that you fight racism in your area, is that you look and you choose to, instead of being afraid of that body, you choose to empower that body in some way or another. Maybe your issue is going to be at the ethnicity, that you truly understand, who is this person in front of me, and are they a Salvadoreño or are they a Argentino? Because those are two very different Hispanic groups, right? And if you're trying to judge one by the other, chances are you will not relate to that person in front of you. So what are you feeling led towards so far as we've gone through now 6 chapters? What's kind of calling to your heart? Or maybe you haven't found it yet. Keep asking yourself that question that I just asked. What's going to call to your heart? What is the arena where you will work towards anti-racist things? How are you going to help defeat part of what's standing in the way? There's a lot of different ways to do it. Find the one that is yours. Any last wonderful words?
Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. Good to have you all with us today. Next week, we will do chapters 7 and 8. All right? Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Good week.
You too.